Korean War in 1953. During the cessation of the war, American soldiers were returned home who had been prisoners of war in China. They started exhibiting very strange behavior. When the boat neared the shore, they were not very happy to come home. Even the sight of their mother's outstretched arms seemingly failed to move them. They were sort of stone-faced. They would start spouting communist propaganda. Some of them had seemed to have been converted to communism, and even 21 Air Force personnel had been persuaded to stay in Korea and start families there.
My name is Harold Webb from West Palm Beach, Florida. My name is Aaron Wilson from Urania, Louisiana. This is a very happy moment for me, for now I am free.
In smaller or large ways, they had collaborated or cooperated or allowed themselves to be coerced by the enemy. Many sociologists and psychiatrists and psychologists who both worked for the army or who worked for institutions like universities were brought together in teams to study why this was happening. And one of the people who headed one of the teams was named Louis Jolyon West. And he was a talented American psychiatrist who was working for the army, and he headed a team that studied the returned soldiers from what was called Operation Little Switch, and these soldiers were displaying some of that behavior, and so they were trying to figure out what exactly had happened. They concluded that it was nothing, if it was brainwashing, it was not the typical kind of notion of what people think brainwashing is, which is some magical hocus pocus where the person loses their mind and like changing the software on a computer. One day they're good old-fashioned Americans and the next day they're these kind of rabid communists. But instead they were describing a process that much more resembled slow, steady, classical behavioral conditioning. So they came up with the words DDD for debility, dependency, and dread. Stability was basically that they'd been put in a situation where their wounds weren't treated and their health was low and they weren't fed very well, so they kind of developed a chronic debility, and sometimes they developed a condition that other soldiers called give-up-itis, where they would just simply lie down and refuse to take food and water and just die. And the second was dependency, that these soldiers were made to be extremely dependent on their captors for any kind of reward or any kind of, even anything resembling a small comfort or luxury or even just food to keep them alive. They were dependent on their captors, so that created in a way a kind of intimate bond. And then the third D was for dread, which was an atmosphere of fear and terror and constant unpredictability, where the prisoner would never be sure what was going to happen next. They could be kept awake for 48 hours or a week. They could be given a drug or not. They could be given food or not. They never knew when that would be coming, and they never knew if their captors would be treating them decently or not. So there was an atmosphere of this kind of extreme unpredictability, and all of that together was what they called DDD, which they said could basically be explained through behavioral principles. And what it resulted in was a dismantling of the self, or a demoralization of, to go back to Maurer's idea, the ultimate demoralization of behavior.
While the purpose of the study was to find out about communist brainwashing techniques, CIA documents show that the agency was interested in developing mind control methods of its own.
Jolly West would eventually achieve celebrity status in conspiracy culture for becoming the first, and one can only hope, the last man to kill an elephant by way of LSD. The elephant's name was Tusko. He resided at the Oklahoma City Zoo and died after a cartridge containing 3,000 times the accepted human dose of LSD was fired into his rump. West also served as a defense witness in the trial of Patty Hearst, who was kidnapped by the self-proclaimed Symbionese Liberation Army and brainwashed into robbing banks.
There's some feeling among experts, and particularly her family, that Patricia Hearst was brainwashed by the Symbionese Liberation Army. One thing cited to substantiate that is that 2 known SLA members, including the slain leader Donald DeFreeze, were inmates at a California prison where sophisticated methods of mind control are practiced on some prisoners.
And drugs are a vital part of therapy here. Everything from sleeping pills to Prolixin, a heavy tranquilizer used to control schizophrenics. What concerns the critics of prison therapy, however, is the danger that the tools of modern psychiatry can also be applied to a captive prison population for convenience instead of treatment, not to make sick inmates better, but simply to make them behave.
In his 1973 State of the State message, then Governor of California, Ronald Reagan, announced plans for the establishment of a biomedical facility at Vacaville. It would be called the Center for the Study of the Reduction of Violence, and would use techniques pioneered by Jose Delgado. Delgado had gained worldwide fame for stopping a charging bull in its tracks by using a gadget he called a stimoceiver, a remote-controlled device that triggered electric impulses in the animal's brain.
Neurophysicist Dr. Jose Delgado was financed by the Office of Naval Research.
That bull was going to stop as it approached you when you pushed the right button?
Scientists always should have faith in science. I have faith in science.
Recently released CIA documents refer to the feasibility of remote control of animals, and that special investigations will be conducted toward the application of selected elements of these techniques to man.
In Delgado's papers, he's basically implanting electrodes in the brains of human beings and experimental animals. In one of these papers, he refers to the animals as mechanical toys. In the Harvard team, there's pictures of a 16-year-old girl. In one picture, she's staring off into nowhere with a bland, empty expression on her face. In another picture, she's strumming on her guitar. In another picture, she's furiously pounding on the wall. All totally controlled by which button is pushed in the neurotransmitter box. When you open somebody's brain like this and you put an electrode in and you keep it in for a long period of time, you're exposing that person to the risk of brain infections, meningitis, seizures, and death.
For prison officials at Vacaville, the idea of controlling inmates through remote control was a tempting prospect, and drafting the outlines of the new program was none other than Jolly West. West's proposal recommended psychosurgery as a tool for controlling prison populations and crime. Remarkably, he also recommended using schools in Chicano and African American neighborhoods to screen for possible, quote, genetic defects. The project was terminated, but only after public outrage forced officials to backtrack. West's research would lead to new dreams of what he called the psychophysiology of conditioning. West noticed that DDD bore an interesting resemblance to post-lobotomy syndrome, as well as altered states of consciousness produced by certain drugs, hypnosis, and mental diseases like schizophrenia. In all of these cases, the notion of self, of free will, is displaced by something more obscure. In West's words, the patient loses all recollection of the fact that he formerly possessed a space-time image, which served to explain the events of the day to him. With these ideas in mind, large funds were poured into the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, headed by Scottish-born psychiatrist Ewan Cameron. A future president of the World Psychiatric Association, Cameron set out to actualize the new vision of total control. He would create real-life blank slates out of his patients by wiping their minds clean and destroying their very notions of self. From there, new behavior patterns could conceivably be built upon the wreckage of their former identities.
The Allen Memorial Institute at the time was probably the leading academic center of psychiatry in Canada, attached to McGill University. And the chairman of McGill University, we're in the 50s into the 60s now, was Dr. Ewan Cameron, originally born in Scotland, emigrated to Canada. And he had money from the CIA under MKUltra to do two basic things: a kind of brainwashing in which he would, for many months in a row, administer massive amounts of electric shock to a person. Linda MacDonald, she got over 100 electroshock treatments in a period of 4 or 5 months. Each time the button was pushed 6 times instead of once. So the electricity delivered to her brain was over 600 normal electroshock treatments. Also, people would get prolonged sleep induced by barbiturates, tranquilizers, antipsychotics, and so on. So this is the depatterning. And what would happen from this massive shock and drug-induced kind of sleep is what happened to Linda MacDonald. She went into the hospital in the spring, slightly depressed, otherwise perfectly normal, functioning, intact person with 5 kids. By August, she was incontinent of urine and feces, unable to feed herself, didn't know her name, didn't know where she was, didn't know what year it was, didn't recognize her husband, and didn't recognize her children. So it's a complete wiping clean of the brain.
They shipped me up to what they call the sleep room, and they gave me all of these electroconvulsive shock treatments and megadoses of drugs and LSD and all of that, and I have no memory of any of that. Nothing of that time of the Allen Memorial or any of my life previous to that, all gone, wiped.
When she was released, she had to very laboriously learn how to play guitar, how to boil an egg, how to keep track of her kids. And this was the purpose of the experimentation. And obviously the CIA was interested in this only for one purpose, which is if they had somebody and they wanted to wipe out their memories, would this method work? And Ewan Cameron proved that it could. Building up the new identity was called psychic driving. And one of the techniques was they played either in Ewan Cameron's voice